Have you ever found yourself in the middle of a discussion or argument with a close friend or loved one, and even in the middle of that argument, you're asking yourself, is this really worth it? Is what we're arguing about really worth all the negative energy that's being expended, the potential damage to our relationship, the hurt feelings? A really wise person once told me to ask yourself this particular question, Bruce, when you get in that kind of situation. He said, ask yourself, is it going to matter a week from now? Is it going to matter a month from now? Is what you're arguing about going to matter a year from now or even 5 years from now? And he said, if the answer to that is no, then be very careful. You don't want to lose friends. You don't want to damage relationships over things that are extremely temporal. The Corinthian church had a multitude of problems. They were arguing about a lot of different things. Some of the things were significant and some maybe not as significant. And as Paul writes his first letter to the Corinthians, he outlines these problems and then he outlines the solutions to each one of these problems. But the root cause of all the problems was the issue of selfishness. Selfishness and pride, which had led to disunity in that church. That was the root cause. So by the time he gets to chapter 13, it's almost as if he changes his tactic. And he gets right to the point. And he says if selfishness is the problem, then the solution is the opposite of selfishness, which is love. Love has been defined in a lot of different ways, but I think perhaps the best definition I've heard of is love is an emotion, but it's not strictly an emotion. It's also a choice of the will. And in that choice of the will, it's desiring the highest and the best for someone else. That's love. So you can see it's the opposite of selfishness. So what Paul is doing in chapter 13, this incredible chapter that you hear quoted at weddings a lot, but what Paul's doing is in the midst of all the discussions, all the problems in Corinth, he gets right to the issue and says, listen, love is permanent. The things you're arguing about, particularly in the context of chapters 12 through 14, these spiritual gifts, these things are temporary, he says, but love is permanent. We know in part, we prophesy in part, but when the completed has come, that which is partial will be done away. You see, they had developed this hierarchy of spiritual gifts where people with gifts like knowledge and tongues and prophecy were considered more spiritual than people who didn't have those gifts. And that's totally untrue. A spiritual gift is given for the common good, and it's for everybody's benefit, not the benefit of the person that has the gift itself. And so what Paul is doing in this climactic chapter, he's making the incredible application of love rather than selfishness to solve problems. The first 7 verses he describes in a way almost unparalleled what love is. He doesn't define it, but he describes it. And then he tells us that love is permanent. But on the other hand, these spiritual gifts that you're arguing about, prophecy, tongues, and knowledge, these things are partial gifts. In fact, there's going to be a time when those are done away. When the completed comes, the partial is going to be done away. But love is permanent. He even says, when I was a child, I used to speak like a child, I thought like a child, I reasoned like a child, but when I became a man, I did away with these things of childhood. Now, he's not putting down these spiritual gifts because they're gifts of the Spirit. All he's saying is that they're temporary. You shouldn't be ruining the testimony of the church with arguments over temporary spiritual gifts. The comparison is between love, which is permanent, and by the way, something they weren't practicing, and the temporary spiritual gifts, in this case, prophecy, tongues, and knowledge, which they were speaking a lot about and arguing a lot about, but those are partial and they're temporary. Love is permanent. It's the spiritual gifts that they're arguing about are things of childhood, things of the immaturity of the church, but once the church matured, those things of childhood would be put away. At the very end of the chapter, he mentions the verse that's often quoted, essentially saying that there are 3 virtues, faith, hope, and love, that remain at this time, and the greatest of them is love. He's not putting down faith and hope. We couldn't get through this life without faith and hope. He's just making a point about the permanence of love. You see, love's the answer to all the problems that we have. Interpersonal problems, the answer is love. The answer is to consider someone else's needs as more important than my own, to desire the highest and the best for someone else. So when you find yourself in the middle of interpersonal difficulties, whether at your church or at work or at home, in a marriage, in a friendship, wherever they may be, consider the answer is not more selfishness. The answer is love. That was the answer for the Corinthians in the first century. That's the answer for us today, to will the highest and the best for someone else. Thanks for watching. I look forward to seeing you next week.